So vastly confusing and in some ways so tremendously dehumanizing. Despite having a good support group, I don't have anyone who truly understands my nature or my experience. My relationships with men have failed, due in great part, I believe, to my circumstances and my fear of being labeled a green card hunter. My career has been halted by my lack of documentation, and my character has been affected by searching for opportunities and being denied because of my legal status. I have constant inner conflict regarding my roots and how Americanized I've become. I've been uprooted, but I legally belong nowhere. So much is stolen when one grows up as an undocumented immigrant, not just time and opportunity, but self-worth and a sense of tribe. I'm in a no man's land. Americans won't accept me, nor do my birth country's citizens identify with me. Neither of you have ever been undocumented immigrants, but I wonder, would you have advice for a soon-to-be legal immigrant at 30 years old, wanting to start a career and real life? I feel like up to now I've been living on pause, although perhaps what I've been lacking is courage. I'm so confused as to how to gain back all the years lost. What say you, sugars? With love, lost in time. Part of the reason that I was really fascinated by this letter, Cheryl, is it's absolutely true. I am pretty much the opposite of, no, I guess a Mayflower person would be the opposite of an undocumented immigrant. But, my family came to the States, a century and a half ago or a century ago. But I did have the extreme and kind of beautiful and unsettling experience of living in El Paso, Texas, right on the border with Mexico. When I first graduated from college, I grew up in a suburb, went to a nice college, and then I landed in El Paso, and I lived in this neighborhood called Sunset Heights. And Sunset Heights actually was definitely kind of dumpy when I lived there, but it used to be where the aristocracy in America lived, and they would actually look down from this top of this hill down across the Rio Grande, and they could see Pancho Villa's army fighting with the Federalists. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was kind of this old staid neighborhood. But interestingly, I lived on the 4th floor and was overlooking the Rio Grande. And what I could see every morning from my porch was the young women mostly being carried across the Rio Grande, which was basically this septic, flow of water that ran between these two concrete embankments. And there would be these day maids coming from Juarez, Mexico, to work for the day in El Paso. They would pay the mulas, the guys who carried them across this usually waist-deep toxic water. They would be on these guys' shoulders, and they would be carried across onto the American side of the embankment. They had their clothes in a little plastic sack, and then they would sort of scramble up the embankment, and there was a little hole in what they call the tortilla curtain, which was this big chain-link fence that separates the two countries. And then on the other side, they would stand there and they would change out of the clothes that got dirty and wet coming across the river, and they would change into the clothes that they wore as a day maid. Now, if they were lucky, nobody from the INS would show up, and they would just be able to change and sort of dash through this low scrub desert to South El Paso and try to integrate as quickly as they could into the life of South El Paso, and then find their way to whatever bus was going to take them to the home where they were going to clean house or do whatever manual, very low-paying job they did as undocumented immigrants in America.
So much of our own economy as a nation is dependent on those undocumented workers. When I lived in New York City, I was a waitress. I don't think that there was one busboy or cook, except for maybe the head chef, who wasn't an undocumented worker.
Right.
They were all of these men from Guatemala and Mexico.
Right.
And, they were undocumented when INS came in or any kind of inspection came in. They would run out the back door. I was asked as a waitress to grab a spatula and go stand back by the grill and pretend that I was the cook.
Right.
It's like the open secret of our country. And Lost in Time, the piece of it that I want to really express is that we feel your pain. Your sorrow is not only palpable, but justified and understandable. It's true that Steve and I haven't shared your experience, but I have no trouble imagining why you would feel lost in time.
That's right. You are in a dislocated state. You are
Right.
profoundly dislocated in every possible way. You are a stranger in a strange land, a person without a country. And in fact, I think it's good for us at this point to talk with Ruben Vives, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter from the Los Angeles Times, writing a brilliant investigative series on Bell City, California, and the corruption of that small town. But more importantly, I think can speak directly to the
Right.
experience of being an undocumented immigrant.
Hi, Ruben. This is Cheryl Strayed. It's so nice to talk to you. Thank you for being on.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
We wanted to talk with you a little bit about your own story. I hope you'll tell us your own story, because I think you've read this letter from Lost in Time, who's really struggling with this profound sense of dislocation and the sense that people around her, she doesn't have a tribe who understand how psychically and emotionally dislocating it is to be an undocumented immigrant in this country. So I was hoping you could tell us your story just to make her feel less alone, and so we know where you're coming from.
Well, when I was a year old, my parents decided to leave me behind in Guatemala. I grew up in a small town called Mazatenango, and my parents came out here to the U.S. For a better life. And for about 4 years, my grandmother sort of essentially kind of watched over me, and somehow I developed this view that she was my mother.
Yeah.
And then at 5 years old, my grandmother says, look, we're going to go on this road trip. So we made a bunch of food, stuffed it in a van along with, my cousins and my aunts, and we all got in this black van and drove north. And to me, I was a child, so I just figured this is a trip. And it wasn't until I arrived in the U.S. here in California, in Los Angeles, that I was actually going to meet my parents for the first time.
Wow.
And so that experience alone was the first sort of impact. Because one, I realized this lady who had been taking care of me is not my mother. She's my grandmother.
Wow.
And now I'm coming to try to understand these two strangers who are standing before me are my parents. And, I'm just a little confused. And what I recall from that moment was my grandmother, sort of whom I saw as my mother, walking away, sort of kind of abandoning me with these strangers. That's how I viewed it. Of course, through the adult eyes, it's like this child's finally being reunited with his parents, but that's not how I viewed it. And that had an impact on me in terms of developing trust and bonding with my parents, because it took a very long time, many years, for me to bond with them.
Because your grandmother went back to Guatemala, is that right?
Yeah, she went back, and I stayed behind with my mom and my dad, and eventually they separated, so I had to go through that process. And I was raised by my mother mostly, so you're the sort of the man of the house, and so you have to kind of grow up a bit. Culturally, I didn't feel so at loss, because in LA it's such a very diverse city. And you can grow up in LA and you can still feel like, okay, so I may be in a different country, but there's people who look like me, there's people who talk like me, and there's people who I at least feel comfortable around. Up until middle school, that changed. We had the big earthquake here, and it sent my mother and I heading east, and we moved into Whittier, which was a very, it had a predominantly Latino area, but where we moved, it was mostly white neighborhood, and I started attending a high school that was, where most of the students were coming from, upper middle class families, and everyone there was white. And, here's this dark-skinned kid with a wide nose coming in, and you definitely start to feel like this sense of, oh, I'm not like everybody else here. I'm different. And I think it was around that time when I started realizing I am standing between two worlds. One is this American country that I've kind of been growing up in, and now there's this other side, which is my cultural side, my roots, my Latino side. So I always had a hard time juggling those sides. I knew I was different. And when I tried to hang out with the other Latino kids who were, that were immigrants, they sort of saw me as an outsider, because they saw me, oh, you're hanging out with that crowd. And so I never really could adjust to either side. Like, well, who am I supposed to be? That question is kind of there, and you don't even realize that that's going to be your life, that sense of middle road, and never really on each side. So growing up as an immigrant, I think this is something that everyone kind of can relate to. You're just sort of kind of wandering down this road on your own, and all you're hoping for is that you'll meet other people who can relate to that. And, at the time, I didn't come across that many people. So that had a tremendous impact on me in terms of trying to determine what my value as a person was. You're almost undermining yourself in the sense of like, well, what's my self-worth here?
Ruben, if you can you talk a little bit about what your legal status was? Because in addition to feeling psychologically, emotionally, socially dislocated, which is exactly in line with Lost in Time and what she's writing about, there's also this additional psychic concern of your legal status. You were an undocumented immigrant, right? How did that play out?
Yeah, that's something that I have a difficult time with trying to address with other folks who are undocumented. My situation was a little different. I didn't know I was undocumented. My mother never really told me that my documentation had expired. My situation was more I had come into this country legally, had a tourist visa, a passport, and then all of that eventually expired at some point. And it wasn't until I was 17 years old that my mother finally decided to tell me, because I was about to turn 18, and this was around the time when Prop 187 was floating in the air, and so there was a lot of animosity towards illegal immigrants.
And what is Prop 187?
Prop 187 was basically, it would prevent undocumented immigrants from receiving any kind of special government services. It would prevent me from going to universities and trying to get a scholarship, and so it would have affected me dramatically. And
Right.
So my mother, and you could also get deported, and she was afraid that might happen. And so she finally told me, look, you're not in this country legally. You're undocumented, and we've been trying to get your paperwork through the immigration system, but we haven't resolved it. And eventually what I found out that my mom was paying this attorney, and he was just basically citing bureaucracy, like, oh, this takes time,
Right.
and basically he's just collecting money, not really doing the work. And at the time when I was, 17 years old, my mother had been working for a reporter here at the LA Times. She was a columnist, actually. Her name was Sean Hubler, and she had done some stories involving an immigration lawyer, and they had befriended each other, and so she reached out to him to help my situation. And I don't know what that man did, but he pushed it through within months. I had a green card. So my situation is different from like Lost in Time. Her situation's been, she's finally now getting over that hurdle. So I never got to experience what it's like not being able to work, not being able to
Right.
do certain things because, there's documentation that's needed. And if you don't have that, you can't progress. And that's why it's very difficult for me, and it's almost in a sense embarrassing, because I feel like some people look up to me that, oh, you were undocumented, now look at you, you're great. How can I do that? What can I do? And I feel like, well, my situation was a little different, and everybody's situation is different.
Yeah.
And we have a former Washington Post reporter, Jose Antonio Vargas. He's still undocumented, and he's now an immigration advocate, and he's come out and explained his story. And I guess that's something that Lost in Time should think of, that she's not alone. There's other people like her. There's me, there's Jose Antonio Vargas. There's Sergio Garcia, the attorney who recently fought just to practice law here in California, and he's undocumented, and there's people who are pushing to move forward despite the hurdles that are in front of them. And, and from my own personal experience, I spent practically my 20s wandering around and trying to figure out, what am I going to do in life? What do I want to become? And, it wasn't until I was 31 years old that kind of changed for me. I started finally realizing I want to be a journalist. I want to make a difference in the world.
It's interesting. I wonder, that feeling you describe, Ruben, of being in between two worlds. How have you contended with that? Because I think Lost in Time is sort of struggling also with that feeling of I'm living on pause. That's the way that she puts it. It's obvious that you found your place at the LA Times and as a reporter, but what was the middle passage between somebody who's in high school feeling between two worlds? The exact same experience, actually, that Lost in Time talks about.
Yeah. Look, it takes time. I remember, I still think of some of my most embarrassing moments when I came to this country. For instance, in elementary school, I remember I peed in my pants because I didn't know how to ask the teacher, may I go to the
Wow.
bathroom in
Mhm.
English.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That was humiliating. I remember vividly the students laughing at me and I'm crying. It was embarrassing not being able to read English books, not being able to do well in math because I didn't understand what the teachers were saying.
Yeah.
That's what I mean by you start to undermine your self-worth. You start to think you're stupid and everybody else is smart.
Mhm.
With all that said, there comes a moment where you sort of accept that, coming to this country is a traumatizing thing. It does have an effect on you. You have to accept, for better or worse, that this is your journey. This is part of your autobiography, so to say. You got to use your experience in your life not as something that you should be embarrassed about. You should be proud. Like, this is who I am. This is what my life has been, my journey, and I'm going to use that to my advantage. And I do use it to my advantage in my career. I go out and talk to folks who are living in these poor neighborhoods who are immigrants who speak Spanish. They're afraid of speaking out because they're undocumented, and I, connect with them and I say, look, I understand what you're going through, and it brings more value to me here in this job, and that's what it's going to do for her.
Yeah, I think that, Ruben, you make such a beautiful point, really, when we sort of accept that our journey, our lives, are full of beauty, but also sorrow and struggle. And to
Hmm.
remember, the intention with which, she was brought to this country because her parents wanted a better life for themselves and for
Right.
her. I mean, her letter, Lost in Time, sounds so sad and despairing. And maybe part of what we can give her today is asking her to go back and remember that that journey was begun with hope. And
Yeah.
so that, it's her work to live out that hope, I guess, to be the woman that her parents wanted her to be and raised her to be and hoped she would be.
Yeah. Lost in Time's talking about how do I gain back all the years I lost. But in fact, all of those years, what Ruben's saying are what make you who you are. The parts that are hopeful and full of opportunity, and the parts that are traumatic and completely dislocating. You can't disavow that past. Ruben's absolutely right. You shouldn't live in it. But those aren't lost years. Those are her years.
Right. And I think,
Yeah.
Ruben, I loved hearing your story and to know now that you're this Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. You go talk to kids in schools, and all of that good stuff in your life was born of all of that struggle and hardship.
Yeah, definitely. And it wasn't just mine. It was my mother. She
Yeah.
struggled. It was watching her. She became mentally ill, and I had to take care of her. I had to drop out of college. I had to put my life on pause to help her back for what she had done for me. She's taking care of me, and so I spent a few years taking care of her while juggling a full-time job, taking care of my young sister, and it was a very difficult time in my life back in my my mid-20s. It was
Mm-hmm.
very difficult, and God, I remember thinking I'm going to drown. There's no way I'm going to come out of this. And there was a little voice in me said, like, no, you got to keep pushing forward. Like, everyone is struggling. Everyone has something that they have to overcome. And then that's how Lost at Time should see it. She's been on the bench for all these years. And guess what? She's been called to now step in and play the game with the rest of us. And she needs to see it like, okay, it's time for me to play, like time for me to show them what I can do. And just look back at your life and say, God, I can't believe I survived all of that. I can't believe I went through all that. And now here I am. And it's like, who knows what's ahead?
It's beautiful. I think it's so true. And it's true. I mean, this is the part where this becomes universal because, of course, in this case, Lost in Time is talking about the struggle of being an undocumented worker, the particular pain of that. But really, Ruben, what you just said applies to so many people in so many different situations.
Right.
People who feel beaten down by whatever burden
Hmm.
they have to bear. And the fact of the matter is we just have to figure out a way to bear it.
Yeah.
What's so remarkable about your story in particular is, as I see it anyway, you saw this immigration lawyer basically kind of scamming your mom. And,
Hmm.
that is the seeds of what years later you would remember and act on when you saw people in Bell City who were being ripped off, essentially.
Yeah, that did have an effect on me when I was out reporting. I would talk to people and I would talk to them about their property taxes, and they were paying the second highest property taxes in the county here in LA. And I mean, how to describe that is that a homeowner in Beverly Hills was paying less in property taxes than a homeowner in this tiny town of Bell that no one really had heard of.
Hmm.
There was a man who told me that he had to force his teenage daughter to get a job because he couldn't afford to pay for the property taxes himself. And it reminded me a little bit of myself. Like, I had to like step in and grow up right
Mm-hmm.
away
Yep.
to help out. And I just felt like, in this case, she didn't have to do that, but she did because of the situation that the city had put the citizens in, So yeah, it does affect you for sure.
Ruben, one of the things that you mentioned when you were telling us about your childhood and those years when you were first in the United States is how alone you felt, that there was one side and the other and you were in the middle of it. And one of the things that Steve and I have talked a lot about on the show is what a great consolation books can be, literature can be. And
Yes.
I just wanted to myself also name a couple of books that might be great for Lost in Time to read, just to
Yes.
see herself on the page, to see that there are people who recognize her experience. Two books
Mm-hmm.
that come to mind for me, fairly recent books that I loved. Christina Henriquez's novel, The Book of Unknown Americans, beautiful book. And my friend, my dear friend Salvador Plasencia, wrote a novel called The People of Paper. He also came to the United States. He came from Mexico when he was a young boy.
Mm-hmm.
He just really wrote to this experience. He actually grew up in Whittier too, as it happens.
When I think about the great books, I thought, well, V.S. Naipaul. I mean, it doesn't need to be people coming from Mexico or Central
Exactly.
America. Graham Greene was writing about narratives of
Yes.
cultural encounter all the time. That's part of the essential project of great books, is to
Yeah.
write about people in passage, literally.
Hmm. So, Ruben, thanks for taking the time to talk to us today.
Absolutely. It's so beautiful to hear your story and also to see, for all of us, the intrepid work that you're doing as a journalist. Part of what you believe in is a fundamental part of the American experience. It's not the only reason people come here or even the main reason, but we do have a free press and you're a big part of that. And I just think it's amazing what you've done, the work you do.
And and I just wanted to add one more thing. One of the things that stood out to me from Lost in Time in her letter was sort of how she feels culturally sort of conflicted.
Yeah.
And, I'll be honest, that's something that I still struggle with today. For me, in terms of cultural identity, here's an example. When people ask me, what's the cultural dish of Guatemala, and I say, I don't know.
Wow.
It's such an embarrassing thing to acknowledge that I don't know. There's times where I have to read about my country's history, about the culture, and then I have this craving to travel back to Guatemala and, get to know every inch of that country so I can, share my culture with people. But I don't have that because, I came here when I was 5 and all I know is, American pop culture. And
Right.
so I still struggle with that today. Every now and then people will ask me about Guatemala and I can only give limited answers. And so I kind of understand what she's going through with that. But
Yeah.
it's just part of who you are, and you just kind of gradually have to accept it and just say, okay, well,
Right.
little by little, I'll start, getting my roots back on that side. But right now I'm here.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, thank you so
Thank
much,
you,
Ruben,
Ruben.
for talking with us.
Sure, no problem. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Take
Take
care.
care.
Bye-bye.
All right, take care.
So, I mean, what he talked about, which is so important for you to hear, Lost in Time, you have to show tremendous patience in the face of persistent doubt. This is a guy who still struggles with doubt, but it's his engine. That is the fate of the exile, undocumented worker in this country or all across the globe as populations continue to migrate, mostly for economic reasons. People are living cleaved lives, and there's nothing that you can do to undo that. So Lost in Time, we have every wish that you will realize that there is a tribe all around you.
Yes.
And these feelings of dislocation are very real, and the stuff you're up against are very real. But those years that you spent are not lost years. Those are your years.
They are not lost. They are not wasted. They are the things that will propel you forward. Those lessons you learned, those experiences you had, those feelings you put into the letter you wrote to us, those will be really profound engines of what's to come. They will inform the way you lead the rest of your life. And so I hope you do it with more hope and less worry.
That's right. Don't live on pause. Live right in forward motion, and good luck on the journey. We wish you every sort of good luck on the journey.
And welcome, welcome, fellow Americans.
That's right.